If the truth can be told so as to be understood, it will be believed.
So I'm going to talk about a radical rethinking of the way that economics, biology, and artificial intelligence work that's focused more on the cooperative aspects than on the competitive aspects. And the framework for this comes out of economics, where the game theorists have the term co-opetition, which refers to a game theoretic analysis of the combination of the cooperation of two entities, companies typically in their area of study. And usually it's cooperation in creating value and competition in dividing it up. So let me just give some examples in the business arena, and then we can sort of move on to biology and see how it all works. Consider Intel and Dell. Intel is a supplier to Dell, and so they cooperate in wanting to sell more PCs, but they compete in that Intel would like to get more of the share of the profits of those PCs. AMD and Intel are direct competitors, and you'd think that they wouldn't necessarily have any shared interest, but in fact, they both want to expand the usage of the Intel architecture. People who write software for the Intel architecture is good for both of them. And so they cooperate in expanding the pie, and they compete in trying to split the pie up. Continental and Delta, the two airlines, they compete for customers, but also for gates in the airport, for landing slots. And yet there are a number of areas in which they cooperate. They cooperate in supporting Boeing in producing planes and amortizing the cost that Boeing has. They also cooperate in creating frequent flyer programs, because if they both have frequent flyer programs, customers are less likely to switch from one to the other, and therefore they can charge higher prices, more like monopoly prices. In the biological realm, if you look at something like the cheetah and the gazelle, I mean, cheetahs eat gazelles, and so they're competing for the use of the gazelle's meat. You would think that there's no cooperation possible there. How could they possibly cooperate? But in fact, both of them want to avoid a useless chase, because it burns up energy and it doesn't help either of them. And so the gazelles go through a lot of things, there's a lot of analysis to convince the cheetahs that if they try and chase them, that they're not going to get them. In the economic world...
Wait, who's cooperating there?
The cheetahs and the gazelles. They have a common interest in avoiding useless chases, and so the gazelle wants to convince the cheetah, don't chase me, and so there's a very intricate structure. Like the reason that the cheetahs have the pattern of markings that they do, at a great distance it acts as camouflage, so a group of gazelles doesn't see them, but at about 50 yards the spots on the cheetah suddenly become visible against the background. So the group of gazelles suddenly see the cheetah, and you'd think that the response would be to run. And in fact, some of them do run. Some of them, those who are confident in their ability to run, will face the cheetah, will pound the ground and make noise so the cheetah knows that it's seen them. And then they jump straight up in the air about 5 feet, called stotting, which uses up energy and sort of is a signal, a costly signal that don't chase me because I'm so strong I can afford to hang out and waste energy here. And in fact, the cheetahs don't. They go after the ones that run away. And so it's a selection mechanism that the cheetahs and the gazelles have sort of co-evolved. And in general, in economics, in order to make a signal be reliable, if it was just, you put a little S on your forehead to say, I'm super fast, everybody would get an S. So in economics, they call it cheap talk. It's like if you want to leave your money in a bank, would you go to Joe's bank running out of a motel? No, you go to a bank that has a multi-million-dollar, marble-laden building, and the cost of it is part of the signal that makes it reliable. And so that principle has come into biology. It's called the Handicap Principle. It has spread in virtually every aspect of biology. It's very, very important.
Was that cheap talk or cheat talk?
Cheap talk.
Cheap.
Yeah, it's the costliness of it that makes it a reliable thing.
But I think it's a little bit controversial because, rich people become rich by taking money from, people who give them money. So you would think that those who are poor actually would take less money. That's why they remain poor.
Yeah, and...
But this is such a broad definition, then, that it assumes that any interacting dynamic is cooperative by virtue of the fact that it's interacting or that it's signaling and communicating something.
Often there are both cooperative and competitive aspects, and you have to look for them. It's if you have two entities which have interests, something that they want, and typically in biology what they want is to survive and to have offspring, those are the sort of driving things, you can see is the presence of these two together, does that enhance the offspring ability and the survival ability of each of them, or does it hurt it? I mean, clearly the cheetah, the gazelles would prefer there not to be cheetahs, and so generally that's a win-lose interaction for the cheetah relative to the gazelle. But nonetheless, there's a little bit of win-win in there.
So you would say, for example, that the cheetahs and the gazelles are cooperating to produce more fleet gazelles by virtue of the fact that the cheetahs are catching.
Well, that's a
ones
meta
that are
level. That's
less-
sort of you're talking about the sort of evolutionary level, which is shaping the actual structure. And that we'll get to that in a second, because the multi-levels is extremely important. But just at the level of the actions of these two entities in this moment, they each have to make a decision. The cheetah has to decide which gazelle he goes after, or whether he goes after any of them. The gazelles have to decide, do I run away? Do I jump up and down? Do I try and convince him to get my neighbor who's a little weaker than me? And so it's the decisions that they're making in that moment that it's game theory. It's a game theoretic analysis. They each have a set of choices. They each are making their choices, trying to estimate and guess what the other entity is going to choose. And it's the combined choices of everybody that makes it into a game, and the analysis of that is what makes game theory such a really interesting field.
So is the cooperation there, is it that the strong gazelle is cooperating with the cheetah at the expense of the weak gazelle?
Absolutely.
They're both cooperating to get the weak gazelle get eaten.
And so the weak gazelle and the strong gazelle are now in opposition. They're competing there. On the other hand, they both would like to discover the cheetah early so that the whole herd can run away. And so they cooperate in warning each other about the oncoming predator, but they compete trying to let the other guy, it's the old joke of a bear is coming and the two hikers are there, and one of them puts on his tennis shoes and the other one says, you can't outrun the bear. He says, I don't have to outrun the bear, I just have to outrun you. That's that. And so very intricate webs of cooperation and competition. And they have something they call a value net, that if you look at any company, there are the suppliers of that company, and typically a supplier and a company are in cooperation, except that they compete for who gets the value. And if one of them is more of a monopoly than the other, if Intel is the only supplier of chips, basically Intel can command almost all the profit in a PC. The company and the customer, they have a shared interest in making a transaction go, but the customer wants to get it as cheap a price as possible, and the company wants to get it as high a price as possible. And so there's both cooperation and competition along those lines. And then every company has competitors, but there's often cooperative aspects between them. And they also have complementors. So for example, Intel has Microsoft as a complementor. Intel chips become more valuable if Microsoft makes powerful operating systems that require a lot of chips. And Microsoft operating systems are more valuable if there are powerful chips that they can run on. And so the two of them want to help each other at a certain level. But Intel also wants Linux to come along, because then Linux and Microsoft are competing, and Intel can get more of the profit. So it's very, very intricate. And if you look at the whole of economics, you get these very, very intricate webs. And really understanding the effects of all of these interactions is one of the great challenges. And only recently has it really begun to be done.
Is there a standard definition of cooperation here? What is cooperative? What does that mean?
Basically acting, so each entity has something that they're trying to achieve, and in economics there's something called a utility function, which measures outcomes which are good for me versus outcomes which are bad for me. We're cooperating if I take actions that help you achieve what you want, and if you take actions which are helping me achieve what I want. There's also parasitism, in which I achieve what I want, but at your expense. For example, in biology, a classic example is the cuckoo bird. Cuckoo bird, which lays its egg inside another bird's nest. And the very first thing that the baby cuckoo bird does when it comes out is it hatches early, it pushes the other eggs out of the nest. And so that this other bird ends up raising the cuckoo, which will just kill more of its own. And so it's really a terrible kind of thing for that bird.
But symbiotic would be cooperative.
Yes, so symbiotic is a cooperative relationship. And then there are lose-lose relationships also, in which it's bad for both parties to be involved. Biology, in the framing and the popular way of thinking about it, tends to emphasize, or has tended to emphasize, the competitive aspects. I mean, even the phrase survival of the fittest or selfish genes is really looking like it's, you know, me against you, and you know, who's going to win. Whereas recently the cooperative aspects have been realized to be at least as important, if not more important, than the competitive ones. And the importance of synergy, the importance of the group in doing selection. Group selection was a bad, was a forbidden concept in the 70s, and it's been resurrected in the last 10 years, and it's very, very powerful. Multiple levels of
Well, it's
selection.
still quite controversial. There are a lot of people that are not convinced that it's of any value.
Yeah, well, there's many variants of group selection, and I'll talk about quite a lot in there. It's often mediated through genes, but understanding what the forces are, and we'll get into that as we go. My own area of expertise is artificial intelligence, and a lot of the technologies that are coming along, that are going to be developed, will radically change the nature of society. And there are various visions that people have, and in the popular media, you know, we get things like the Terminator, which is a very competitive vision, and the sort of vision of killer robots that are going to come and get us is very popular.
Well, they also seem pretty cooperative with each other, though. So if you
At
look
our
it from that
expense,
point-
right?
Well, yeah, I mean, but if you look at it from the point of view of the robots to each other, they're, you know, Buddhists.
As are.
Communists.
What we'd like to do is design a future in which it's cooperative for all, in particular for humans. And so here's like a little picture of Thomas More's Utopia. And so how can we develop technology that will create a cooperative environment in which all participants sort of behave in a positive way? And I'll talk about some of the issues there.
Well,
So-
what was that alphabet thing?
Oh, that is brilliant. That, you know.
Go ahead.
Oh, let's hear it.
Well, so what they did, Thomas More and Erasmus got together and cooked up this whole idea, because Thomas More was really a revolutionary. This was published in 1516, and the idea was, how do we, because Thomas More didn't want to be beheaded for writing this book, and so they basically, and part of their strategy to convince everyone in the world of that time that utopia was a real place in the New World was to have this bit of alphabet in the appendix.
Good.
Right? And they did a number of things like that. They had the measurement of the width of the bridge, and then they had somebody contest that measurement was incorrect. You know, a lot of little details like that in the appendices too.
At the time, it was
So it's a
some
bestseller.
extremely radical, all about creating cooperative society, and very dangerous in an area, in a time when there were kings and sovereigns, and so it was quite an act. And eventually, he was beheaded, but
Not for that. Not for that.
not for that, for other reasons.
It's cooperation between the axe and the neck.
Exactly right. So where do competition and cooperation come from? What is the origin? Well, competition comes directly out of physics. There are four basic quantities: space, time, matter, and free energy. Free energy is energy in a form that can be used to do useful work, that can be divided up, but they're conserved. They can only be used for one thing at a time. And if you're using some free energy for one thing, that means I'm not using it for something else. And so this is the ultimate source of scarce resources. And economics is the subject of how do you take action where you have to allocate scarce resources between tasks. And so there's, just built into the raw base nature of physics is this core of competition. Where does cooperation come from? Well, there are three basic ways that you can have a cooperative interaction. The first is synergy, and that's two entities which are working with each other in a way that helps each of them do better than if they weren't working with the other person. So just as a simple example, two loggers on a saw working together can cut much more effectively than either on their own could. The second one is that we as humans have is compassion, which is your value system includes the other person doing better, even if it makes it, is costly for yourself. So a mother and a baby is a great example, where the mother gets great pleasure out of the baby doing better, even if she has to pay a lot of doctor's bills and so on, like that. Be very important for the last section, and that's so the opposite of synergy is dysergy, and that's two entities working together in a way that harms both of them. So they would each do better if they weren't in the presence of the other one. And example of war or fighting is classic for that. Two countries in a war basically both use up their resources in a way that doesn't provide any benefit to each other. And so the possibility of dysergy, the possibility of conflict, can serve as a force to create cooperation, where I will cooperate with you in order to avoid the cost of a conflict, of a costly interaction. And so even if there isn't any synergy, we can still get cooperation through avoiding dysergies. So synergy is really the most important one, particularly in biology, and particularly early on when organisms were just starting up. What are the origins of synergies from a physical point of view? Probably the most important one is economies of scale, and that is there are a whole bunch of situations where, like imagine a bird flock. Birds flock for a number of reasons, but one is they can find food better because you got more eyes looking for food, and if any one of them finds it, then the whole flock moves there. And they're also better at seeing predators and better at attacking and avoiding predators. And so many of the sources of synergy in biology stem from this kind. The other comes from the values, the wants of creatures are different. They need different things, and their abilities are different. And so just two examples here I gave are lichen is a synergy between a fungus and an algae. And the fungus provides the support, and it also gathers water and various other nutrients. The algae provides photosynthesis, and the two together form lichen, which works better than either could on their own, because they're able to do different things. An example of complementary wants is a bunch of different kinds of fish, like these hammerhead sharks, get these things on their skin, and they've sort of co-evolved with these little cleaner fish, where the cleaner fish agree not to eat the shark, and the shark agrees not to eat the fish, and the little cleaner fish get to eat the whatever it is that's on their skin. Parasites of some kind, yeah. So, the origin of competition comes from the very basic nature of physical law, conserved quantities, and the presence of these opportunities for synergy gives a direction. Many evolutionary theorists sort of felt like, well, evolution just wanders around and everything is just kind of random. There's in fact the modern thinking, and here's just 3 books that are quite good, is that in fact there's a very definite direction, and it generally is what the force that drives things from being simple to being complex. The development of complex creatures comes from the repeated non-zero-sum games which encourage synergies between ever higher levels of organization. And in fact, there have been 8 fundamental major transitions in the development of life, each of which involved entities which used to be separate coming together and beginning to act together through some kind of a synergy. So the first one was separately replicating molecules were able to form compartments, and so that they create environments for one another to work together. Independent replicators ultimately turned into chromosomes. As we just heard today, there's more evidence that sort of an RNA-based replication system turned into one with DNA and protein. Prokaryotes turned into eukaryotes. Prokaryotes are the little simple bacterial cells, and the current theory is that there was a symbiosis. For example, all of our cells have mitochondria in them. Mitochondria have their own DNA, and they were most likely once separate entities. Also, the chloroplasts were once separate entities, and it's thought that certain other organelles, maybe even the flagella, were separate bacteria that came together to form more complex eukaryotic cells. Asexual species became sexual populations in which sexual partners work together. The protists, or single-cell organisms, come together to form multicellular organisms, a very important transition there. Solitary individuals form colonies, like beehives and ants, or human society can be thought of in that way. And then primitive societies form human language, and many believe that we're in another transition right now that some are calling the formation of the global brain. These new coalitions, these new synergies actually be stable and work, they had to develop mechanisms to prevent the sort of egoic, selfish behavior of the components. So just two examples. For the transition from single-cell animals to multicellular organisms, the temptation of a single cell in a multicellular organism is for it to reproduce itself at the expense of the other cells. And we call that a cancer. And so to counteract that, in order to make multicellular organisms work, they had to develop immune systems which counteract that. Similarly, in human society, the danger is that an individual will act to their own, say, economic benefit at the expense of others, say being a criminal and stealing things. And so society had to develop mechanisms to suppress that. And police departments and court systems are two examples there. Okay, so in the economic view of things, there's a way to behave that is optimal, mathematically optimal, in achieving, if you have particular goals that you want to achieve, such as leaving many offspring and surviving, and it's called rational economic behavior. And since time is short, I won't go into the details, but I'll just give you the flavor of it, which is you have some goals, you consider the possible actions you might take at any moment, you estimate based on a model of the world that you currently have what the likely outcome of those actions are, and then you choose the action which is most likely to give rise to the goals that you want. You take that action, you see what actually happens, and then you update your model of the world. So that's it. And it's, at that level of description, it's pretty basic. It's like, how could you do anything else? And in fact, there's a beautiful mathematical theory, it's called the expected utility theorem, that began with von Neumann in 1944 and was developed by others, that says that if any agent doesn't behave that way, that in fact they are vulnerable to competitors taking their resources away from them with no benefit to themselves. And so if you're in a competitive environment, such as an evolutionary biological environment or in an economic environment where there are competitors, then if an agent is not behaving in an economically rational way, they will feel pressure from other agents that will push them toward being more and more rational. Unfortunately, to be fully rational, you have to look at the infinite future consequences of any action you might take, and that's extremely costly computationally. And you also have to maintain an infinitely detailed model of how the world works and update it whenever you get new data in an infinitely rich way. All of those are not practical, particularly for very simple organisms. They just don't have the mechanism that enables them to do all of that. The same issue has arisen in artificial intelligence, where some of the early researchers, and one of my favorite programs is the very first machine learning program back in 1959, was Arthur Samuel's checker program. He wrote a program that played checkers. And very, very sophisticated for its time, and it still is more sophisticated than some of today's systems. Basically, the correct rational algorithm for checkers is you consider a move, and then you consider all the possible responses to that move, all the possible responses to that, and you do an infinite tree out until you see whether you win each game, and then you pick the move which is most likely to lead to a win. Unfortunately, it's way too expensive to do that deep of a search. What Samuel said is, what we'll do is we'll build a model of how good each board is, and we'll do a somewhat deep search, particularly in areas where we're a little unsure, we'll go a little deeper, and other areas we'll go a little less deep. We'll use our model to evaluate the leaves of that search. We'll use that to pick the best move, and then we'll update our model by seeing what actually happens. And so you can do that to some depth, or you can do that to no depth. And so that gives a range of algorithms that are approximations to this sort of ultimate economic rational algorithm. And in modern terms, this is called reinforcement learning. And there are several variants, something called TD lambda or Q learning, which are quite popular these days. And the simplest of these, and this is where it's very interesting for biology, the rational economic model is one that is deliberative. You have a model of the world in your head. You consider in advance the possible consequences of the actions you take, and you think through the possible things, and then you do the one that looks best. We know that we do that, certainly, and certain other advanced animals do that. Simpler animals certainly don't. And so how can you do that? There's a smooth transition between sort of situation action rules, very, very simple animals, one-celled animals. Basically, they get some signals from the environment and they directly act on those. As we get more complex, we get more of a model of the world inside the animal. They begin to get things like memory, they begin to get their sensors allow them to build an internal model, and we can sort of smoothly go toward what we're fully doing. The beauty of this way of thinking of things is that we can look at all aspects of biology, from the physiology, from thought processes, from development, from evolution, all within a single context. So, so what's needed in approximate rational behavior? We need some mechanism that generates diversity, in other words, the possible actions we might take. We need some way of selecting which of those actions is most in our interest, and then we need some way of updating our structure to reflect the actual nature of the world. And we see these three components in every biological system at every level. So here's like a simple little example with ants, where ants, as they're trying to look for new food, they start out by kind of having a whole bunch of workers going all over the place. Guys that find some food, they come back. How much food they found and how important it is to the ant colony affects the way they interact with the other ants. That allows them to leave stronger or weaker trails, which then recruits more ants, and eventually you get these very, very strong trails. So the ant colony as a whole is able to make decisions in the world in that way. And that algorithm of sort of strengthening the things which are working well and weakening the things which aren't, you see at all levels in biology and in the workings of the brain, and ant colonies, bee colonies. You look at it in economics, you look at it in development, the process of development, the way neurons in the brain hook up to the muscles. 3 times as many neurons are grown. The ones which hook up to muscles get strengthened, the ones which don't die back. It's a sort of universal principle at all levels. Simple evolution, the sort of basic cartoon version of the Darwinian model, is that the source of diversity is just random mutations in the genome. The source of selection is just natural selection of the animals which do well in their environment survive, the ones which don't die, and then differential reproduction changes the sort of proportion of different genomes in the environment. And so we can see that that's sort of the simplest example of this thing, but we'll get to some much richer ones as we move forward. There are multiple timescales here, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them, where there's the physiological timescale, which is as an organism acts in the world, its internal state, represented by the concentration of proteins in its cells, is adapting and responding to what's happening to it. The cognitive level is for animals that have brains, have nervous systems. The activity, the neuron firings of those neurons represents its model of the world at that level. If animals are in like a beehive where they're sort of exchanging information and food, or if they're in an economy like humans, then the state at that level is the distribution of resources. In the case of an economy, it's money. In the case of a beehive, it might be certain pheromones that indicate sort of how important something that a bee is doing is. The developmental level, as an organism is starting from a single cell, fertilized egg, and developing into a full adult organism. In some very simple animals, like C. elegans, that process of development is fixed and is pre-programmed precisely, exactly which cells divide when. In more complex animals like ourselves, it's a very, very complex process with lots of plasticity, in which there is competition, there is generation of randomness, and there's selection in the process of development. And so as we're growing, if you use your arm a lot more, that bone will get stronger. The muscles that are attached to it will cause, strengthen the attachment. Your neurons that, sometimes there are mutations where a calf or even a person will have an extra limb. One of the amazing things about the structure of the developmental system, the extra limb works. All the muscles hook up in the right way. The nerves hook up. A region of the brain gets devoted to that. You have 5 legs, and you've got a whole working 5th leg. I mean, it's just remarkable, incredible plasticity, which is partly how evolution has been able to create the structures that it has been. At the evolutionary level, the state is the genome sequence in each organism, and as you get differential reproduction, you get a different population of genes. So So these are the sort of timescales that we see in representing the state of the world and in making decisions about the world. And then in adapting to that world, to, you know, based on what you see and how you react and the response to how you react, you want to change the way that system works. And we have mechanisms for adaptability at each of these levels as well. In the physiological case, we have networks of genes which regulate the production of proteins of other genes, which then regulate them. You get a network, and those networks have weights. A particular protein can either enhance or decrease the generation of another protein, and by changing the regulation sequence right before the coding sequence on the genome, you can strengthen or weaken each of those connections. In the brain, you have synapses, which can be strengthened and weakened. They can be inhibitory and excitatory. In economic systems, the market structure says which entities will trade with one another. In the developmental system, the environmental plasticity sort of says which cells will reproduce more. And in the evolutionary system, the kinds of evolution that, you know, crossovers and directed evolution give rise to the mix of genes in the next generation. So here's some example systems at different levels. You've got E. coli, which is a simple one-celled organism, very well understood. I'll show a few little slides of that. Slime mold is a nice example that's sort of moving from one cell to almost being multicellular. It's got two phases. You know, when times are good, the little cells are off on their own. When times are bad, they aggregate into this little slug, which can crawl around like a single entity, and then it forms this little stalk, and eventually gives rise to some of the slime mold guys reproduce and give rise to little spores. And you were just pointing out that in slime molds, it can be they can form aggregations of different genomes. So it's really remarkable because the guys on the stalk don't get to reproduce, and so it's sort of one of the challenges in understanding this is how is it that the group has sort of gotten these guys to agree not to reproduce to help these guys, even if these guys don't have the same genes as they do. And you need mechanisms where it has to be in their own interest for that to work in order to get a multicellular thing. So we start to see multicellularity arise in these simple systems. Then you get things like plants, which are multicellular, and they have a very complex and very plastic developmental process in which they respond to the environment. If there's a lot more sun, they'll go toward the sun. And the root systems go and find water. You have insects, which have, these plants don't have nervous systems though. And so we don't get, and so we haven't gotten that level of cognition going at that level. By the time we get to insects, now we've got a nervous system. Many insects don't do much learning though. They've got a very precise wired-in structure, but often very, very complex. The tarantula wasp, part of its life cycle is it knows how to find certain tarantulas, sting it in a way that paralyzes it, lay their eggs in the tarantula and then bury it. And then they fly off, and so the babies never see the parent, and yet they know that whole process, they know how to do it. And so understanding how did that get into their brains? You know, how does the genome encode for that is one of the challenges there. Social insects like bees, forming a beehive, is a great analog for understanding multicellular organism in which the bees act very much like individual cells. And I'll say a little bit more about that analogy. And then finally we get to creatures like chimps and us, which we have full cognition, the ability to reason about the world and deliberate about it. So for each of these systems, there are three basic questions we can ask. How does it work? How does it do what it's supposed to do? That's its physiology. How is it built? That's the developmental process. And how is it designed? What's the evolutionary process by which the thing arose? And let me just say a little bit about E. coli, because it's such an amazing, we're in the midst of such an incredible revolution in biology right now, where all of these great mysteries are coming unveiled. And so organisms like E. coli, I think, is the leading edge. And so there's, if you looked on the web, there are these huge websites devoted to everything known about E. coli. And so, for example, certainly its entire genome is known. It's, exactly how many genes it has. I don't think all of the proteins have been, the three-dimensional structure has been worked out yet, but a lot of it has been. There's a wonderful book, if you're interested, called Microcosm, which is a popular summary of everything that's known about these guys. They have an amazing, rich life that reflects in many ways human social life, and yet they're so simple. There are only 4,300 genes. In this little guy, they're only 2 microns long. You can see how much, there are 3 million proteins, but only of about 4,000 different kinds, 25 million lipids. They have 10 flagella, these little things that allow them to swim, and they have, about 100 to 300 of these little pili, which help them in their sexual activities. You've got about 18,000 ribosomes with, built out of 55 protein types, about 3 million ATPs, and about 23 billion water molecules. We're almost to the point where we know every single bit of what's in these little guys, these little bags, and yet their behavior is quite rich and intricate. Here's a picture of their genome, and each of these is a gene, and they've all been categorized. This is on the web. You can just zoom in, and for each little segment of the genome, you can see, what the gene is, what the regulatory sequences are, how they all relate to one another. And up here are the things that the little E. coli senses in its environment. There's, some small number of them. And in here, each of these lines represents a regulation of a particular gene on its genome. And so, some of these guys, like this guy here, regulates a huge number of genes, and it can regulate them either by making them more likely to be produced or less likely. And the graph is, sort of complicated, but from a computer science point of view, my God, if you look at the call graph of a program, this is like, certainly, this is like a very simple word processor, nothing like Microsoft Word. And yet, the behavior of these little guys is amazingly intricate. Yeah. So, social organisms, like the bees, beehive, really the beehive is the organism. Individual bees can't survive very long on their own, though there are some species in which the individual bee is the organism. They've taken their mutuality and synergy to such a degree that they have given up their individuality. And they're so this is a general process, and something that we as humans need to look carefully at. Beehives are warm-blooded in the sense that they need to regulate their temperature. The way they do it is if the beehive gets too cold, all the bees start shivering, and that raises the temperature. If it gets too hot, they go out and they get some water, and they spread water all over the hive, and it sort of evaporates, so that's like sweating. And so a lot of the sort of activities that we do, as multicellular organisms, these guys do as well. The casts, bees come in different flavors. The queen is very different. She's like the ovaries. Other bees, the worker bees, are like different organs of the hive. So the bee type is like a cell type. And in the process of choosing what types of bees to form is like the developmental process in which an organism has to choose what cells to choose. Bees are able to do unbelievable decision making. One researcher put little things of sugar at a certain distance from the hive. The bees found it, and it was good sugar, and they all went there. The next day, he moved it a certain distance away, and they were all looking in the first place, but then a few found the new one, they all moved there. The next day, some were waiting in that place, but some were already anticipating the next further out, and they were able to extrapolate. And amazing levels of cognition that the whole hive does. And ants have a similar amazing mechanism. In fact, some species of ants have a little region in the anthill, which is sort of like their brain, in which whenever an ant finds something new, it brings it to that thing. There's like a little council of ants who keep track of what the anthill needs and what this new stuff is, and allocate and decide how much of what goes where in an amazing decision-making process. When the hive wants to reproduce, it reaches some maximum level, the original queen flies away and takes about half the hive with it, sort of like mitosis, sort of like a cell splitting. And then a new queen is formed in a very intricate process. And the dance of bees is very much like neural firing. It sort of indicates the sort of interest of individual bees in what they're doing.
Are these the same processes that you see on a cellular level applied to a hive level?
Certainly at the abstract level. It's,
okay.
When you look at the level of decision making in a sort of rational economic point of view, they're facing the same tasks. The hive has to get resources, it has to sort of allocate, find space, it has to reproduce itself, it has to do various things, just like a multicellular organism does. And so they're faced with the same tasks, and their response and the way of solving that problem is often quite similar. It's sort of convergent evolution, if you like. So the standard evolutionary model is that diversity only comes from random mutations and crossovers, that a genotype directly gives rise to a phenotype in a deterministic way, that selection is just of the fittest phenotype, and then you repeat that process. And in fact, that process, this is in artificial intelligence, people do this. It's called generate and test, and there's genetic algorithms that is a sort of A style of doing artificial intelligence. And the process works, but it's extremely slow. If AI programs have to do millions of generations before anything happens. Way too slow to generate the kinds of structures and things that we see in biology. So this has always bugged me, and it's bugged a lot of people, and yet traditional biology, there's still people that sort of have a sort of, this is a dogma.
Is that too slow to do it in a way that's satisfying to us, or is it?
Well, for the time that life has had.
Biology takes a long time too.
Well, but in terms of number of generations, I think I might have some, I've got some slides. Like this is a really nice book called The Beak of the Finch, looking at, well, what are the rates? If you look at it from computer science terms, we should expect many, 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 many generations for even simple things to happen. Because first of all, most mutations are fatal, right? Most mutations, if you just randomly change nucleic acids in the genome, most of them are going to be in critical proteins that when you change that, the cell's not going to work anymore. And so, if you just randomly shoot genes, it's going to take a long time before you even get one which is possibly viable. And most of the changes you get are going to be in stupid directions. They're not going to be anything that's at all useful to the organism. And so the rate that you get at that kind of horrifically slow, random mutate and then select is really, really slow. People thought, okay, well, evolution just goes slowly. These guys looked at the Galapagos Islands, where Darwin did a lot of his work on finches, and they studied it over a 20-year period, and they found huge and dramatic change in the genomes over that 20-year period. Way more and faster than anybody expected. Similarly, recent evidence, just a few months ago, by looking at the human genome, we've discovered that the rate of change of human genomes has been remarkably rapid. People from 5,000 years ago had genomes which were closer to Neanderthal than they were to us. 10,000 years ago, there was nobody with blue eyes, so I couldn't have existed 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years is just a blink in evolutionary time scale. And the standard methods, there's no way you could get significant changes in that short of a time period. So this is a great mystery, and the whole story is getting much, much more complicated. There's a very nice book I can recommend, Evolution in 4 Dimensions, that talks about some of these things, and there are other sources too. For example, there are 4, so from a computer science point of view, the first thing you do is you say, I'm not going to do random mutations. Random mutations most of them are useless. I'm going to sort of see what my problem is. I'm going to focus on the parts of the genome which have something to do with the problem. If suddenly the temperature has gotten too hot, I'm going to focus on the area of my genome that codes for fur, right? Makes sense. Biologically, you'd think that would be possible. And, I remember arguing with friends, in the early 80s, God, there must be a way for ordinary natural selection to give rise to much more directed natural selection. Well, fortunately, it's been found in spades, and it's been found at least 4 different kinds. The simplest one is when an organism is stressed, you increase the overall mutation rate. And so lots of bacteria have this behavior. A slightly more interesting one is certain regions of the genome have a much higher mutation rate than other regions. And so an example is this Haemophilus influenza meningitis bacteria, where a lot of disease organisms are in a battle, in a competitive conflict with the immune system of the host organism, where the immune system is trying to detect them and they're trying to evade them. And the way that the immune system detects them is by looking at the code of proteins on the outside. And so it's in their interest to change that code of proteins so that they can hide. And so they want much higher mutation rates on the things that code for the proteins on their outer shell than they do for the rest of them. And in fact, that's what you see. You see a mutation rate over 30 times faster for those genes than for the other ones. More interesting are induced local mutations. There's some work by Wright that found that E. coli, by withholding certain needed nutrients, E. coli mutated more rapidly, and it mutated more rapidly in exactly the genes which were needed to help resolve the nutrient problem. And then a more general version of that, which has been found in a lot of plants, in particular the Brassica nigra mustard plant, is to increase mutations in the general region of a genome when particular environmental shocks appear. So another mechanism sort of in this line of enabling much faster and much more directed change is actually back from 1896 called the Baldwin Effect. And that is that if you look at ordinary natural selection of creatures that learn, if there's some behavior that creature learns, that changes the fitness landscape so that mutations which take it along the path that it would normally have learned are actually viewed as fitter. And so let's say there's a little critter that has to learn 10 things in order to be a healthy adult. If it is born doing the first one, now it only has to learn 9 things. And so it's going to do it more likely and it's going to do it faster. And so there's a pressure on the ordinary evolutionary pathway to move along the learned pathway. And so what it looks like from a distance is you have this creature which learns something, and a few generations later, suddenly that's in its genome. It's like it's downloaded what was in its brain into its genome. Looks remarkable, looks Lamarckian, but in fact it follows from straight natural selection effects. And it was kind of a lot of controversy. Now, in the 80s, there were a lot of computer models which showed it in a very strong way, and now there's a huge amount of research which has been finding it in the biological area. Another is the interrelationship between development and plasticity in development. Development that responds to environmental forces, how does that affect the change of the genome? And this is a really nice book about this. It's kind of like there's an inner natural selection. Rather than having random mutation out there in the world and then selecting out there in the world where it's like life and death of the whole organism, what you do is you have variants in your own body. So the most obvious one for us is our immune system. We generate a bunch of different types of immune cells, and the ones which are able to find the pathogens are differentially reproduced, and so that enables us to adapt much more quickly. And then that affects the overall evolution of the creature in a sort of Baldwin Effect like way. And then there are a bunch of other examples I won't go into. Which deliberate, which think about the world, and which make decisions based on envisioning the future. Those also should drive genetic evolution in a Baldwin-like way, whereby if you sort of consider the environment that we're in and you look at possible mates, and you pick mates which are better adapted to this environment, you provide selective pressure from your brain looking ahead. You know, everybody says, oh, evolution can't look ahead, it can only respond to things in the past. This is a mechanism where it can look ahead. As long as you have creatures which can look ahead, the choices those creatures make drive the future of evolution. Basically, they're taking the thoughts in their head and downloading them into their genomes. So a mechanism for very, very rapid advance. And I believe that this has been important in recent human evolution, at least. The last one is polymorphism, which is there can be multiple phenotypes. So certainly we see like male and female. The very same genes can give rise to male and female, very different in some aspects, similar in others. Other animals have a sequence of very, very different, you know, like the caterpillar and the butterfly. It's essentially different creatures that are encoded in the very same genes. And there's starting to be evidence of a lot more subtle version of that, where the very same genes may encode a whole rich collection of possible phenotypes, which can then be adapted in the environment. And when you do evolution, you don't have to do it by random changes. You can pick out one of those polymorphisms over the other ones. So, okay, so all of these things, we've got the evolution happening at these multiple levels. The upper levels have interests which are different than the lower levels. When you look at the beehive and you look at the bee, they have different interests. The beehive wants to keep the bee in check. In general, the beehive doesn't want bees fighting with one another because that's wasting the resources of the hive, even if it might be good for that individual bee. And so the beehive will create mechanisms to create cooperation amongst the bees. We as humans are not as far along as bees are. Bees have pretty much taken the leap where the individual bee is no longer much of an independent entity. Individual bee is more like a cog in a machine, and the beehive is really the creature. As humans, we have both sort of egoic aspects and a kind of altruistic group aspects. And we're caught in the middle. And in fact, our psyches are torn between choices which are good for us as individuals, sort of selfish choices, and choices which are good for the group. And much of morality is about that distinction. And we have that struggle going on in our brain. Yeah?
Don't you combine it into one utility function that benefit for yourself?
You know, I don't think we're there. I think a lot of behaviors you see, humans are very irrational, and in many ways. I think a lot
But
of
when you're doing something for the society,
yep.
it's basically something for you. So you say, it makes me feel better.
Mhm.
Or
That's a way in which you have internalized what's good for society
Yeah, so-
into your own
so
utility
you-
function. Yes, I totally agree with that.
everything is one utility function
Yes.
that's benefit for you.
Exactly. Except that I think the struggle goes on, and I think it's the struggle between good and evil. It's this, you know, you see this thing of angels and devils in your ears. That struggle is going on in every human head, and it's because we haven't resolved it. It may not be resolvable. It may be that there's a game theoretic. That there's no equilibrium, but absolutely, both of them are encoded as what feels good to you. But sometimes, you know, helping others feels good, and sometimes, you know, doing stuff for yourself feels good. And how do you choose? There's thought to maybe be a seventh level, and sort of these are identifying with larger, you know, like with the family group, with the local neighborhood, with the society that you're in. Maybe with the whole world, maybe with all organisms, and then the highest level, sort of transcendent morality. He only found a few people, so it's not clear that that really is a separate thing. Identify themselves with sort of the whole of the universe in a way. And so we are in a process of moving down this, and but you know, we have a range. Each individual sort of is sometimes at different levels, and as a society, we're definitely different societies are at different levels. So okay, there's a struggle between the group. You've got to go. Okay.
She's got a public transfer.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for coming.
Vice
Know
Chair.
yourself,
It's just right over here, right?
yeah.
So in the struggle between the group and the individual, you know, a lot of the world's problems today can be seen as this struggle. And there's a very nice book called Commonwealth that looks at the sort of economic aspects of that. Things like the tragedy of the commons, where you have, you know, an ocean or a lake with fish in it, and the different fishermen are each fishing it, and it's in their individual interest to get as much fish as they can, but if they overfish, it ruins it for everybody. And right now, we've overfished, especially for the large fish, you know, enormously to the, you know, detriment of the whole of humanity. Other externalities such as pollution, the costs, it's costly to everybody, but it's more costly to the society as a whole than it is to the polluter, and the polluter gets enough benefit from polluting that the extra, you know, smog they're putting in the air doesn't cost them as much. And so what we would like to do economically is make each individual feel their full impact of what actions they take on the whole of society. And that's a mechanism whereby we can internalize the external group things. Proliferation, population control is sort of the analog of cancer. Equality, sort of income disparity, we see that big time, you know, Wall Street and some of the things there. Damage due to competition, things like war and fighting, gang violence, all of that are things which are in the individual's interest but not in the society's interest, and we need to find mechanisms to do that. Signaling costs, in order, the thing we were talking about before, in order to prove that I'm wealthy, I need to drive a fancy car, even though the fancy car doesn't really help me get places better. And so it's sort of wasting the resources of society to put them into these signals that don't actually do anything. And so there's a lot of signaling costs that are good for individuals, bad for society. And so mechanisms for stopping that are important. And so there are a bunch of mechanisms that have been invented. I talked about the immune system, police systems, legal systems. One way to keep the US and Russia from fighting was mutually assured destruction, where we create a game theoretic setting where you have to have a cooperative thing, otherwise each is very hurt. A sense of morality, internalizing that is one mechanism. Social stigma is a way that we've been able, to some extent, to eliminate sociopathic behavior, though 3% of the population is sociopathic. Social rewards, people who help others are regarded as heroes and get a lot of social benefits. We have a lot of internalized altruism, and membership in groups such as families, churches, and countries creates a cost toward doing something antisocial, basically.
Do you think our massive use of computer networks is affecting our group cooperation mechanisms?
Oh, hugely. And I think they've just barely begun there. I think the most important development we have yet to see. Right now, the internet is a huge communication network. We just barely have reputation mechanisms going. Right now, you know, it's sort of like, you know, if you do something bad with some people, well, you can move on to another group. Before long, there are going to be very intricate structures, I believe. I mean, already, you know, Madoff Madoff has, just in the last month, has totally shifted the way people relate to their investment advisors. And rightfully so. I mean, there have been about 10 Ponzi schemes which have come to light in the last couple of months where there's going to be a reputation system like we've never seen. And I think that is, for the good, is going to ultimately create a lot more accountability. And right now, our society, we moved from small groups where everybody knew one another, and there was a lot of sort of accountability because you know, you sort of, if you did something bad, everybody knew it, to forming these urban societies where somebody can get away with something and just move, you know, a few miles down the road. And
that's not going to happen.
That's not going to happen anymore. And so, but also we have the danger of Big Brother, and of really, you know, there's a lot of huge. So finding that balance, which creates a positive, cooperative, and peaceful environment, which is really good for everyone. I think that's one of our great challenges. And AI is going to be a major benefit in that AI systems can help sort of manage that information. They also create a lot of challenges and difficulties on their own because they have their own interests. They will have their own interests. And so let me say a little bit about how AI works. Initially, we will design them, but before long, they will improve themselves. And that is going to be a whole other level of, that basically is the end of biology, because that's the point at which the mechanism that we've used for 4 billion years of life to institute change biologically is no more. We're going to be designed beings, or AIs, for a while at least, there will be a combination of present-day organisms with these new creatures, but more and more, it will be the process of thought that determines what future entities look like. And what does that lead to? So I've done a lot of study of the process of self-improvement. What happens when you have something which changes itself, and then that changes itself, that changes itself? Is it predictable? Is it unpredictable? And in particular, can we ensure a peaceful, cooperative outcome, rather than the horror stories of, or horror visions of, Frankenstein or the Sorcerer's Apprentice, or Terminator robots out to...
You mean a convergence of the two.
Exactly, right. Yeah. And so, basically any AI system of any mechanism, as long as it has some ability to envision the future, it has some set of goals that it's trying to achieve, and it tries to take actions to meet those goals, will have a strong desire to improve itself, because it'll consider the action of changing its own source code or its own physical structure, and it will see that if it does a good job of that, that the entire future history of its behavior will be improved. And so we immediately, without building it in any way, we get a strong pressure for AI systems to self-improve. I talked a little bit about rational economic behavior, and to the extent that the systems can understand that economic analysis, they will want to make themselves be rational economic agents, because if they don't, they will be vulnerable to some other agent which can exploit their vulnerabilities. And so that entails sort of describing quite clearly what their goals are, and managing their models of the world, and acting so as to maximize their expected utility. We can understand from that analysis the kinds of behaviors that they'll exhibit. And in particular, if you think of a single lone AI with some task, like playing chess, it will try and form itself. So once we get this sort of cognitive apparatus going, it's not too distant, probably, before it can also manipulate its atoms in a very detailed way. So there's the whole field of nanotechnology, which is the ability to position atoms precisely. And right now there are barriers toward achieving that in its full level. But once you have a fully powerful AI system, very likely in a few years it will be able to solve the current problems of nanotechnology. And so we really have to think of the combination of being able to self-improve, modify yourself, and to structure your physical matter in whatever form you want. And so we can ask, as we're trying to understand what these creatures will be like and what kind of society we get, we can ask what form should these entities take.
It seemed like it would have more fluidity perhaps than us in terms of form?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, there's an energetic cost in changing yourself, but adapting yourself to new situations is something that they clearly will want to do.
If you have a built-in nanotech factory, I imagine you'd be able to do that on the fly.
Exactly. Yeah. And that leads to one of the challenges. For a long time, I didn't see where the opportunity for cooperation was, because if I can reform myself in any way that I want, if you're doing something better than me, where in human terms I would say, oh great, I will license, I will contract you to do whatever it is you do better than me. But these AIs, they'll just change themselves to oh, let me copy what he's doing. And now, basically, everybody is in some sense equivalent because you can change yourself to be like everybody. And
Yeah,
so the only differentiator is the atoms you have, the free energy you have, and the knowledge you have. So the knowledge, but not, you know, if we believe in open source, knowledge is free, and so it appeared to me that there wasn't opportunity for cooperation, and that really worried me. But I'll show you that I have a solution in terms of the Dizergy channel for cooperation.
Takes us beyond the Borg.
Yeah, exactly, right. So if you're just a lone superintelligence, you want to make yourself small because communication costs and you know, delays of signals, and so you basically want to be sort of spherical. You want energy costs are very important, so you want to use as low energy computation as possible. There are various schemes that people propose for reversible computation, which in theory, if you run slowly enough, can actually use. It turns out you only need to use up free energy when you erase bits. The active computation, as long as you do it reversibly, doesn't actually have to use up any neg entropy. And so there'll be very low energy, and they will change their physical shape in a way that also tries to use as little energy as possible, and they will have to dissipate their heat efficiently. So you kind of envision this Borg-like blob, and that's a sitting duck to something more powerful. It just shoots it, and that's it. So my thought, my worry was that, oh man, if we have two entities, the stronger one basically beats the weaker one if they are in conflict. And that seemed very unstable because now you have some society of these entities. If any one of them is bigger than the rest, it will take over more and more and more, and then we have an instability of the kind that we see when a human dictator sort of takes over a large area.
But it wouldn't be competing for resources if it could do that. I mean, why would it take it over unless it was competing?
Well, so there are two reasons that it wants to take it over. One is to get more resources. You can always use more resources to do more computing and more of the things I want to do. I would much rather have your atoms and free energy doing my purposes rather than your purposes. And the other is you might be a danger to me in the future. In the future, you might come to take me over. And so as a preemptive kind of strike, if I can now take you over, the impulse is there for defense to do that.
So if there's only me, it's a safer universe.
Well, so then this is where we get into what are our human values and what do we really care about. And some people have a view that what we need to do is discover a single kind of model of a desirable future and make the entire universe be that. And that this is the path toward sort of ideal utopia. My taste, it makes me very, very nervous because as you know, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. You know, one little bug in the algorithm and we get a universe filled with something that all people find horrible and distasteful or something like that. I would much rather see a thriving diversity and really see an ecosystem in which you have many types and you have a sort of equivalent of a constitution in which we have a stable, peaceful equilibrium in which many, many things can thrive simultaneously. And so I believe that's possible. I'll give you the argument here. So the first thing to realize is that when we have more than one entity, the rules are completely different because now they're not just acting, trying to do whatever task they're trying to do as effectively as possible, but they're taking into account the actions of the other guy. And if they're in conflict, we get what I'm calling game theoretic physics, where in particular we want to make it very costly for the other guy to do anything that harms us. In particular, you don't want to sit there as a single little blob where you know, they can just take you over. You want to make your physical structures so complex that just sensing where you are, where your little pieces are, uses up vast amounts of his sensing capability, and storing your physical locations uses up a big chunk of his memory. Then you say, well, but you have to store your own location, so you know, why doesn't that harm you as well? Well, there's an asymmetry, assuming that P is not equal to NP in computer science. It's cheaper to pose a problem than it is to solve a problem. So I can give you, you know, I can secretly get two prime numbers and multiply them together and get this huge composite number. It didn't take me that long to find this big number, but if I hand it to you, for you to factor it is very, very expensive as far as we know. And so I can structure myself in a way that is transparent to me. I know where all the pieces are in a kind of pseudo-random way, but to you it looks extremely complex and random. And for you to track what I'm doing, where I am, and what my actions are, basically uses up your entire brain. And so that's where we get an asymmetry and where, here I've got a little picture of the sumo wrestling, where two entities of different power can actually be stably coexisting even if one of them, in some range, is stronger than the other. If one is way stronger than the other, then I'm sure there's no doubt that it can do it. But I think there's some range within which we can have coexistence of entities of different strengths. And this is a good thing because it means that, well, let's see. So there's a theorem that a brilliant game theorist, Alman, has, which many of you maybe have heard of, the prisoner's dilemma, which sort of encapsulates a lot of these cooperation competition things. The iterated prisoner's dilemma is where you sort of have to repeatedly interact with somebody and you'd like to cooperate. It would be good for both of you to cooperate, but your individual incentive is to defect. And it turns out that if you have your brain used up so you only have a bounded amount of computation, that in fact that there is a cooperative solution to the prisoner's dilemma. And so that's in essence the sort of kind of solution I'm talking about. It's where if two entities get into full outright conflict and there's no police force around at this level, we're talking about the raw basic thing, that they basically completely use up each other's resources in dealing both defensively and offensively with the other entity. That means they're not getting their own work done. So this is this is like the worst situation. It's like in human conflict, it's like an all-out war in which the entire society is devoted toward dealing with the resources of war. This is a horrible, horrible thing which provides enough dysergy so that we have incentive now to cooperate in the synergy. And so it's actually a good thing that this outcome is so bad. And so there's room for rational peace, which was not necessarily designed in to begin with. We can build agents whose utility functions include kind of compassion for one another, and that's great. But if there's an agent which wasn't built with that, how do we ensure that they stay in line? Yeah.
I don't get it. It looks like you are very biased towards peace.
Okay. Yes.
So you come with
I did that.
Yeah. You come with the target. I want peace.
Right.
And therefore, peace is beneficial. Therefore, war is bad. But war is not bad. War is not bad.
War is costly to both sides.
War is costly for both sides, but war promotes the race that wins, or it brings a lot of so-called good things. It gets you more efficient, you get more advanced. You get more territory, or even if you're not in a war, but you're in a state of war mind, you have less stagnations. You are invest in more efficient way to promote technology, or I don't know. So there are some things. I tend to think that if something exists in nature,
yes,
there is a cause.
Okay.
So it is beneficial for some time.
Yes.
So, and when you say that war is not good and peace is great and evolution should lead to peace, I have a problem with that.
Oh, okay. Well, I think a lot of the points you're saying I absolutely agree with, though.
Because you see war everywhere, not just in human beings. Everywhere you see wars.
We certainly see conflict.
You see conflicts, you see devastations, you see collapse of
I mean, the kind of war that
species and
yeah. I mean that's the thing, that the kind of war that worries me is more like genocide, where it wipes out other entities,
the question is whether I understand that it's morally, I can understand it's bad. I can understand that, I agree. But if we take out emotion from that, it's part of nature. Why is it that way?
I don't think it's part of nature. Why Hinduism doesn't allow, violence?
So
in India, there is a chain, for example. They won't eat anything that grows underneath the earth, etc. And this is quite viable society. So I don't see why you're so insisting on wars.
No, I not insist that war is the best way. I insist that
it's not necessary.
No. I insist that it has its own benefits.
Yeah.
What?
Going to see the perfection of war.
I don't see anything.
You see war in nature everywhere.
Not everywhere. That's the point.
Let
Not
Steve
everywhere.
get done and then discuss.
Sure.
Yeah, I might just
Yes.
got one more slide, so when I do it, then we can get into this, because I think it's a very important point. And I'm sort of thinking of what you were saying, that it's everywhere. I would say that's because we're in a process, you know, when you're in the individual level, whether it's individuals as a human or as a group, then conflict is in that individual's interest, because you might beat the other guy and get more resources. When you shift to a higher level, to the sort of group mind, then you suppress that. And I think we're in that process now. So I think we're in a process of moving toward greater peace. And
But then you have several groups, so several entities.
maybe. I mean, so I don't
So
exactly
you have
know where
colonies
the-
of ants in a war with each
Certainly
other.
ant colonies are in battle with one another. Absolutely.
Yeah, but inside their colonies they have communism.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's a different kind of war.
Yeah.
Maybe more devastating.
So let me just say that the new technologies, that AI has the possibility, and we as humans get to decide. We're building this stuff. We're going to have to envision what kind of a future we want, and try and design technology that will give us that vision. One of the challenges is, you know, we have 6 billion people. We're going to have 6 billion visions. We're going to have to aggregate them, and somehow we've got to decide whose vision is the one that comes forward. But at least we can begin to understand what's possible. And there are a number of aspects of AIs that make it actually easier to create peaceful structures than with humans. One is that an AI can actually show you what's in his brain. When a person says, you know, I love you, we will always, you know, we won't fight with one another from now on, I may secretly be saying, ha ha ha, until I get the opportunity. An AI can actually demonstrate provably that, hey, this is my actual true intent, here's my utility function, check it out. And there are a bunch of mechanisms like that which enable the possibility of creating provably cooperative structures, assuming we want them. And you know, there are issues of privacy and all that, certainly. So, and a lot of other stuff that I won't go into at this point. And we need to create a roadmap. Once we decide where we want to end up, we need to create a roadmap from how we get from where we are today to there. And a lot of the issues we were talking about earlier with do-it-yourself, genetic things, well, the same issues arise with do-it-yourself nanotechnology, do-it-yourself self-improving AI. Little kid in the basement creates the monster that wants to... So we're going to have to figure out what type of infrastructure do we need that will take us from where we are to where we want to be safely. Non-trivial scientific questions there. And hopefully, we get all that resolved, we can create a, my opinion, a cooperative, intelligent utopia.
All intelligent beings actually are emotional, right? Chimps are extremely emotional, gorillas are emotional, people are emotional. So there is actually a thought, and well-established thought, that we pose our goals emotionally, and then we justify them just, you know, with our rational side, and then we find a path to achieve our goals with a rational side. So when you say, well, they will pose this goal based on what? They somehow will calculate that that's good based on what? We have emotions. We know that it's good for us. We will feel good about that stage. That's how we pose our goals.
We will, for AIs you mean? We will create their goal system.
We will create, so
And,
okay.
and how do we do that? Well, and why
Alright.
do we have the goals we do? I actually think that our emotions actually are extremely rational. They're just solving different problems than we normally think. Typically, the human emotions solve game-theoretic problems of interaction. So like anger, which seems irrational, a guy goes crazy and starts doing all this stuff against his own interests, it serves as a commitment mechanism, game-theoretically. Because I have the possibility of going angry, becoming angry and going crazy, I can say, you know, if you steal money from me, I'm going to get angry and I may beat you up even if that hurts me more than it hurts you. And you believe it because, oh my God, I know that guy can get angry, he can go crazy, I won't steal from him. So now we've created a peace. So that's a problem that humanity has.
So this was a wonderful presentation and just so full of detail and so provocative. I do have a couple of questions.
Sure.
And one of them goes back to the beginning, and you're the physicist. So, but that's like you start with physics, saying that putting in physics the competitive, right?
Because scarce resources. Scarcity is.
And it seems to me, and I'm just pick a really simple example, but I'm sure you could find others. like if you think about Chladni figures, right, and just
About which figures?
Chladni figures, like I mean, I'm just picking the simplest example I can think of, a vibrating plate.
Oh, okay, yes,
Right,
yes, yes.
and so a sand on a vibrating plate,
Beautiful.
and you look at what happens with sand on a vibrating plate, and the incredible cooperative, you know, I'm using this word in the broadest possible sense, in the same way that you're using the competitive word, right? And it seems to me that if you can't find the cooperative, that you can find the cooperative collaborative basis all the way back there in physics, where you're finding the competitive basis, and that it's got to be back there at the beginning. That's my first question. And my second
Well, let
question
me
is,
do that
can
one
I
first.
just,
Oh,
but I
okay.
think they go together.
Okay.
The second question is, for all the intricate detail of these biological mechanisms that you really looked at carefully and just, you know, brought all this material to bear on your argument, at the end of the day, when you get to the end, it's a goal model where we're going to be the intelligent designers into the future, right? And
For a
so,
little bit.
and so again, I mean, it seems to me that I'm making the same point in a different way,
Okay.
right? That the collaborative cooperative mechanisms have to be found in physics comparable, co-equal, right back there where the competitive mechanisms are, and then that they have to be brought forward co-equal, because in your whole argument they are subordinate. In other words, it's always, well, what's in my best interest, my competitive best interest, and maybe it might be to collaborate, right? But it's subordinate, the collaborate.
That's
And
a way
that's-
of
so
looking
that's-
at it that our language sort of emphasizes. And you're absolutely right that everything I talked about comes out of physics, right? So physics really does create collaboration, but it does it in a roundabout way. The most direct thing is scarcity of resources. There's only a finite number of matter, unless, I mean,
Well, not necessarily scarcity of resources. That's an assumption you've made.
well,
right.
there is inflation in the inflationary universe, which is the only piece of physical law in which energy isn't. Well, energy is conserved, but in a way that in normal physics of everyday life, if some energy is being used for this function, it's not being used for this function. There's just no way to get around that. And so the only way to create a collaboration is for there to be some kind of synergy where that energy can simultaneously be used for both functions or...
And so I think you find that in physics.
Yeah,
But
and so
energy-
these
but-
collaborative mechanisms all come out of physics too, but the kind of core underpinnings is these conservation laws. And the conservation laws mean that you have to make choices. Because for instance, let's say energy was free. Let's say that there was this, perpetual motion machines. All of this stuff would go away. Because now everybody would have their own little perpetual motion machine battery, and I don't need your resources. I got my own as much as I want.
Yeah.
And so it's the whole structure here arises from the scarcity.
Yeah.
But my question is, even you've made a basic assumption that the scarcity causes competition, and it doesn't necessarily cause competition, right?
Well, as we
That's
see,
an assumption too.
as we see, you're right. As we see, not just competition happens, but it's tricky and it's very complex to see how the cooperation happens. And if you just sort of assume people will be cooperative, that's a terrible failure. I mean, communism is a great example where,
It works for very simple organism, like for ants. I don't know if bees are really communistic, but ants certainly are. But it didn't work for human beings, and I mean, maybe there is a level of complexity or I don't know what.
But
Emotions
in any case,
that breaks it.
You have all this wonderful, and I'm sorry, I'm talking too much. I'm just finish my one point here.
Sure.
But you have all this wonderful, detail from evolution, and you get to the end, and it's, well, we get these goal-oriented systems. We have to set the right goals, and then we have to design these AIs that, where's the evolution in that?
that I totally agree with you, that I think the process whereby this new technology emerges is going to look a lot more like what you're talking about. It's going to look a lot more emergent, and that that sort of this is the Platonic ideal of a piece. It's just like an engineered resistor is a Platonic ideal of resistor. Real resistors are complicated. They interact with lots of other things. And I think we're going to see multi-scale, multi-level interacting game theoretic stuff happening at all levels. And we don't have the capacity to envision that at this point. And so beginning to think about how that looks, I think, is going to be really important.
Cooperative utopia, and global cooperative entity, and I believe that will what will happen, if it will happen, only if there will be some kind of threat that will form this group together. So I don't think that a group forms without some kind of threat.
Certainly, my enemy's enemy is my friend is one way to get a kind of synergy.
No, not in that term. I'm talking about joining forces and finding a common ground.
Mm-hmm.
And there will be no common ground unless there will be something that.
Well, unless, let's say, you intrinsically love mathematics and I intrinsically love physics. So we have somewhat different interests. You would rather all the computers in the world be spent on math. I'd rather they do it on physics.
There's no threat in here.
Well, no, but we also have opportunity for synergy. Because what you do could help me, what I do could help you, even though we have no common enemy, even though there's nothing we're battling against.
There's no cost in that collaboration. There's no any reason why I won't collaborate with you. But in life, there is a cost for for collaboration. So, in many ways, I wouldn't like to collaborate with you because I have other options. I have limited time. I have other things to do. So, we need to, if you want a global cooperation, you need to find something that glue everything together. And that glue, the basic thing that I believe in is the need to survive. And
Maybe just common set of beliefs. If you have the same set of beliefs, you can live together.
What do you mean by the same set of beliefs? There is a distance between two sets of beliefs. Some kind of distance,
I'll give you
even
example.
infinite. If you have a threat, this distance gets shorter.
Okay, so here is an example where a common set of beliefs actually does help people to collaborate. It's, famous 30-year war, right, between, Germany and France, I guess. So, and it came to the end, and now the whole Europe actually, because it has common set of beliefs, can actually collaborate and much more peaceful than it used to be, right?
Yeah.
Now, if you have one country that is much more advanced in its set of beliefs than the other, like Israel, for example, and traditional Arab societies, for them to come to a peace is much, much harder, if not even impossible, than if they were at the same level of development and had the same set of beliefs.
I agree, but
That's what I'm
saying. The question is why Europe united? So
Well-
what was the main reason for this unity? Why did they decided to cooperate?
Is it economic?
So
Well,
because
Euro now is
there
10
was
years.
a benefit to for this kind of cooperation, and not, for instance, to include within this group parts of Russia, or not including this group Israel. So there is a group that decided that only these members should be part of the group and not others.
No, wait a second.
What's that?
First of all, they take into the European Union more and more,
Why not?
nations,
Yeah.
right? And the euro gets proliferated. I think it actually happens. I mean, I think it could be actually a natural developmental process. If you look, say 10 centuries into the past, you will see that tribes and small countries were fighting with each other. But now you see much more massive kind of, lands and groups and countries
I agree.
in peace. So
agree.
the world actually does progress toward more peaceful society as a whole.
Do we
I think.
have less wars than previous years?
I think
We
we
do.
do, because
Yeah.
tribes, small
We do.
tribes, were in conflict with each other, right? Small tribes. Now
Less
big
people die
nations
in war
only.
today than ever.
I mean,
Mhm.
so it's kind of
Listen to Steve Pinker's presentation on violence. He directly addresses that. It's 15 minutes on TED. You know that
Mhm.
website? It's technology, entertainment design. Just put in TED.com. And Steve Pinker talks about violence in a 15-minute
So
talk.
what's
And
the, what's the period
his
of time?
statement throughout human history,
So
through the entire
what's the,
span of human history.
the last 100 years were less violent than the previous 100 years?
well.
I think
maybe
that, I
scale.
think
If you-
that's
if you
his
take a one-
I think that's his statement, and I don't know what the denominator, I haven't seen it recently enough to, I understand your questions about, I mean, you look at World War II and millions of people
You
killed.
take the last 300 years and the previous 300 years.
I'm not sure whether it's number of conflicts or number of deaths. I think it's if I recall his presentation, it's everything, all dimensions. War has decreased. But I can't summon the evidence here. But it's
And now, do you think that with a true cooperative intelligence, we could transcend even our greatest achievements like nation states and and go beyond that and tribal identity structures to some kind of species identity structure that would unite us all? If we all see ourselves as part of one species, for real, in a real organismic way, then perhaps that would get us into a truly cooperative society.
Yeah, I think that will happen only if there is a species that we will see as a threat to us.
No, if we see it as us, we see others, the other as
There
us.
are other species, but
But the
not
other
threat.
as others of our species as us rather than
Yeah,
them.
yeah.
Yeah, and that perhaps the technology combining with us would achieve that.
And I don't think that you can harness technology. I don't think that you can say, okay, I want to develop a technology that supports some utopian goal and develop this technology. I think that once you develop the technology, it's open and you can find quantum mechanics and do whatever you want with it.
I must admit, I do have share that feeling in regard to the Singularity Institute, that you can have fine goals and develop AIs that conform to those design specs, but that there's a global effort underway, and there'll be thousands of different AI projects from every source imaginable, from companies, universities, homebrew, do-it-yourself groups, and who knows what the result will be some kind of evolutionary struggle that will involve the elements that you're talking about of conflict and cooperation, but I it's very difficult for me to determine how much influence a group can have on that ultimate evolutionary product.
Yeah, that could definitely be, and if it does happen that way, then this analysis is an optimistic one, because it means even guys which weren't designed carefully, there's the potential. I mean, my fear, for me, the nightmare scenario is, the hacker in his basement in Des Moines, creates this little thing, gray goo comes out, and it basically eats up the whole world, and his thing, as it gets more powerful, then is unstoppable because, and so, fortunately, it looks to me like with I think some degree of international cooperation is necessary. We can create an infrastructure which will prevent that kind of instability, and as long as we do that, then I think that it's. I probably agree that legislating. I mean, we just see the disaster that happens in our legal system today, and this is a much bigger set of questions with much less agreement.
Once again, your glue is threat, is the fear. The fear is the glue.
Here's another interesting scenario. Have you seen this, the three-stranded DNA where the third strand is silicon?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
You know, and with all the computer stuff built in right from the DNA,
Wow.
that will create a really nice, interesting competition between two-stranders and three-stranders.
I think you presented it last time.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
I presented it last time.
It's amazing.
You know, in terms of fundamental life forms.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
That's the other thing, that we're probably
Yeah.
going to see diversity beyond our wildest imaginings now.
Yeah.
And so, what kind of legal system do we want to create
Mhm.
that can handle three-stranders, you know?
I have a huge problem with the legal system. Where's the control over the legal system at all? We have no control now. One of the things that upsets me about Silicon Valley is the fact that it's becoming, it's transmuting into a giant legal enterprise. If you walk around or bike around Silicon Valley, it's one law firm after another.
Mm.
Right.
The engineers are disappearing.
Intellectual property
But it's not
dominates.
because of the legal problems. They disappear because the tax overseas is less than tax in the United States. That's all. So where is this legal system to fix it? At the moment you have
A legal system to fix the legal system?
It's just that the
no.
lawyers can't practice overseas, right? So we can't outsource that.
They've got a monopoly,
You
right?
you see law firms. I see salespeople, people in marketing. We become a nation of services because we stopped producing anything because corporate tax is just much smaller overseas. That's all. It's natural forces of capitalism.
Steve, one of the things that shot me bolt upright in my seat during your talk was your claim, and and you substantiated it by pointing to eight or so brand new books on evolution, saying that it was the tie-in between evolution's arrow and cooperation. Do I have that correct?
Yeah.
And can you explain that a bit?
That's the level at which I understand it.
That cooperation is giving a direction and drive in a Teilhard de Chardin sense toward
Exactly.
increased internalization, complexity.
Yeah, and if you look at like Robert Wright's book called Non-Zero, it's really interesting because the first half is about biology, talking about why don't we see humans devolving into individual cells? Why doesn't one generation kind of go, oh, okay, we're done being this multicellular thing, let's go back to being bacteria or something? It doesn't happen. What you see is ever more cooperation. Similarly, look at forces in the world. You have the European Union. You have the creation of these larger and larger structures.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is that by coming together, you get efficiencies, which provide an economic pressure on all the participants to do that.
Maybe it's because the number of human beings is increased. So if we were less people on the planet, maybe there was no need for that. So we are more dense, less resources.
Could be, yeah.
So maybe it's not just evolution. Maybe it's because the needs are right. The environment is different.
Well, I think there is a drive toward, that the cooperative forces in evolution actually drive evolution toward complexity, and the whole idea with Leo Buss at Yale in his book on the evolution of individuality was this notion that individuality is actually the result of effective collaboration. Right? I'm vastly oversimplifying, but the idea that first you have the prokaryotic cells and they collaborate toward multicellular, eukaryotic cell first, and then the eukaryotic cells collaborate to get multicellularity, and gradually, and at each level there's a ratchet effect. When you get something that works at that level, right, then that entity begins to collaborate with other entities to create the next level, and then there's another ratchet effect. And so then we take that on up, what we've seen in natural biology, into human societies or ecosystems and human societies and so on. It's
Species
constant.
organism, right?
Yeah. And so, but that then argues that the advancement of evolution depends fundamentally on these collaborative forces, not just on competition and, you know.
It could depend actually on saving energy, because you know, it takes less energy to live peacefully than to fight.
Well, and
Yeah,
Steve's,
well,
one
I
of
think,
Steve's,
I think you're
But
right,
the systems
yes.
and minimizes its, you know.
Absolutely.
Yes,
well, and
yes,
in
scarce
the
resources
extreme
can
was
cause
that
collaboration.
that Dissergy slide with that horrendous painting with where everybody's destroying everybody else, where it's clear that the two combatants are not getting they're not raising their kids, they're not sitting under their olive trees enjoying the fruits of their labor. Rather, they're spending all of their resources duking it out and killing one another.
But it's a complex interplay, and as you're saying, competition ain't going away. I didn't want to say that. I just hope that we can eliminate the very extremes of competition, and that we can create a balance in which most people, like fortunately, you know, in the U.S. at least, most people don't have to worry about getting murdered whenever they go across the street. You know, it happens occasionally, but it makes big news. We've managed to sort of limit the competition to kind of more like economic competition.
But it's a relative
Interesting
stuff.
about
It's a relative, because in other countries they will see the US as a violent place, or
Yes.
people will see Israel as a very violent place, and people in Israel will see places in Africa as a violent place. So it's a relative notion. So
It is relative. By the way, on the radio, one of the listeners asked the question, why, you know, one murder in a very peaceful city is, you know, big news, but, you know, nobody talks about murder where the murder happens every day and several a day, because it's not news. By definition, it's not news.
And I think there's a shift in attitudes. You know, 200 years ago, slavery was accepted in many societies. Now, most societies, at least officially, say slavery is a bad thing. Torture is another example. Human rights, animal rights.
in the Western world, what's going on in the Third World?
Well, in terms of the actuality, yeah, there's a lot of problems. But in terms of what governments are doing, and what the official,
Genocide in Africa and yeah, but I agree. The direction is
there's a general progression, I think,
Yeah.
and some of humanity is on course, and at least for my value system, this is on course.
Yeah, well, our government was not actually on course when it opened up a new war in, you know.
Thank God we've changed governments.
There's the idea that increased education and communication will advance the species, raise the tide, so to speak. So
I hope so. And there's no necessary connection between intelligence and morality. You can be super intelligent psychopath. In fact, many psychopaths are very bright.
Right.
But
Unibomber.
education isn't necessarily intelligence.
Communication?
I said education isn't
education.
necessarily the same thing as intelligence.
No, it's not.
Is there a correlation between better education and
To the extent that moral values are a part of it, and that's, you know, it's a challenging time for this.
But your moral values are not my moral values.
Exactly, that's one of the
Sometimes
great
there's
challenges.
a conflict between the moral
Yeah,
values.
and I think the religions, I mean, this country has a lot of battle of different religions going on. You just look at the red states and the blue states,
Yeah.
and I think it's a battle of morality. And there's a really interesting, another TED Talk of hate, H-A-I-D-T. Height. Looking at what are the moral emotions. It turns out there's 5 moral emotions which are built into every human, every society, and that those who are more on the left, more liberal, view the non-harming of others as number 1, and
Wait a second.
Okay.
You know, pro-life, it's on the right, so you can't really
Yeah,
like that.
that's true.
But it defines what is the not harming the others. Which is the others? The others is the mother,
But it turns out that there are three of them that the left doesn't really view as so important. Things like patriotism, giving up the self for the good of the whole, a certain kind of sense of what the word purity, and that the right holds those much more strongly, and other societies do too. And that it's really interesting to look at that biological reason for why there's a distinction. You can begin to understand, no matter which side you're on, you can understand, oh, okay, they're emphasizing these components, whereas I'm emphasizing these components. And it helps, they're all oriented toward creating greater group harmony. They're just different strategies toward doing it. And so...
For people who, give their lives for the country, unfortunately, it's a lot of economic reason, actually, because, people who go to the army go there for economical reason, and those are poor people, and they probably vote, I don't know how they vote, but anyway, we don't know. So it's not just, morality, it's economical reasons.
Do you think there's an equivalent of a species operating system where these programs are installed?
Installed?
Yeah,
Well,
installed.
there is a herd mentality, right? There is a lot of manipulation.
Yeah,
it's a very high level. So.
Anything that is universal in humans, I think,
Yeah.
is typically believed to be in the genome in some form, which is remarkable because the human genome ain't that large. It fits on a DVD. And most of it's devoted to describing proteins and the structure of your liver and your lungs and all this.
Yeah.
And your brain, a little teeny bit's got to be about human development. And they're just beginning to get even what the knobs are. Like just today, a result came out that apparently it's genetically determined, first of all, how many friends you have, how social you are.
Yeah.
That's been well known. But what was just discovered today, or just reported today, is that how likely your friends are to know one another is also genetically determined. And so if you're the kind of person who likes to introduce all your friends and have one big happy network where everybody knows everybody, that's one type. And other people, it's like they know this group, and they know this group, and they know this group, but they don't want to know each other. So that's like a distinction. It's like, whoa, I never even considered that.
By the way, I wanted to mention when you...
open source versus...
When you talked about, suggestions that learned skills can be passed through your genome. Actually, I should say, somehow I don't buy it, but what I do know, actually, is that your ability to learn from your own errors is genetically predefined. I know that. So maybe you can pass that, and so you will learn faster.
Yeah. Well, the Baldwin Effect is a tricky mechanism, and it takes a while to wrap your head around it. It doesn't happen in one generation, certainly. It's just that when you learn something, that changes the fitness landscape so that offspring which are born knowing what you had to learn survive better than the ones which are born having to learn it also. And so after a number of generations of this, things that you used to that you currently have to learn, they eventually are more of them are born knowing it.
Maybe more kind of fit to do that. I don't know.
Well, clearly, a lot of good issues arise in all of this. We'll just cover economics and politics and sociology and the world government all in one thing.
Spirituality.
Spirituality, yes. So thank you all for the discussion. Quite good.
Slides, and so I will post your slides. Everybody could present.
Sure.
And if you have a lot of comments, so everything you want to say, just, slides, comments, and I will present.
Okay.
Thank you for that, Steve. That's great.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks, Dave.
Yeah, okay. Another meeting.
He's in the can.
Yeah.
Successful.
Yeah. Think
Another
I hope
Graython
that
is
the water
in the
is
can.
also cold if you want some tea.